The old couch was at one side of the fireplace, at a convenient angle to watch the firelight and yet not hiding the bookshelves. On the other side, with its back toward the first landing of the rude staircase, stood an old upright piano with a pile of shabby music on the top and a book of songs open on the rack. On the floor in the space between was spread a worn and faded ingrain rug, its original colors and pattern long since blended into neutral grays and browns, which strangely harmonized with the rustic surroundings. A few comfortable but shabby chairs were scattered about in a homelike way, and a few pictures in plain frames were hung on the clean new partitions. Under one stood a small oak desk and a few writing materials. A little further on a plain library table held a few magazines and papers and a cherished book or two. There had been no attempt to cover the wide, bare floor spaces, save by a small dingy rug or two or a strip of carpet carefully brushed and flung here and there in front of a chair. There was no pretension and therefore no incongruity. The only luxurious thing in the place was the bright electric light, and yet it all looked pleasant and inviting. " Say, now, this is great !" reiterated the young owner of the place, sinking into the nearest chair and looking about him with admiration. " Who would ever have imagined you could make a barn look like this? Why, you're a genius, Miss Hollister. You're a real artist." Shirley, in an old gingham dress, with her sleeves rolled high and her hair fluffing wilfully in disorder about her hot cheeks, stood before him in dismay. She had been working hard, and was all too conscious of the brief time before they must be done. And to have company just now, and such company, put her to confusion; but the honest admiration in the young man's voice did much to restore her equilibrium. She began to pull down her sleeves and sit down to receive her callers properly, but he at once insisted that she should not delay on his account, and seeing her shyness, immediately plunged into some questions about the water pipes, which brought about a more businesslike footing and relieved her embarrassment. He was soon on his way to the partitioned corner which was to be the kitchen, telling Shirley how it was going to be no trouble to run a pipe from the spring and have a faucet put in, and that it should be done on the morrow. Then he called to Elizabeth: "Kid, what did you do with those eats you brought along? I think it would be a good time to hand them out. I'm hungry. Suppose you take George out to the car to help you bring them in, and let's have a picnic." Then turning to Shirley he explained: "Elizabeth and I are great ones to have something along to eat. It makes one hungry to ride, you know." The children needed no second word, but all hurried out to the car, and came back with a great bag of most delicious oranges and several boxes of fancy cakes and crackers, and they all sat down to enjoy them, laughing and chattering, not at all like landlord and tenants. " Now, what's to do next?" demanded the landlord as soon as the repast was finished. " I'm going to help. We're not here to hinder, and we must make up for the time we have stopped you. What were you and George doing, Miss Carol, when we arrived?" " Unpacking dishes," giggled Carol, looking askance at the frowning Shirley, who was shaking her head at Carol behind Graham's back. Shirley had no mind to have the elegant landlord see the dismal state of the Hollister crockery. But the young man was not to be so easily put off, and to Carol's secret delight insisted upon helping despite Shirley's most earnest protests that it was not necessary to do anything more that evening. He and Elizabeth repaired to the dining room end of the barn and helped unpack dishes, pans, kettles, knives and forks, and arrange them on the shelves that George had improvised out of a large old bookcase that used to be his father's. After all, there was something in good breeding, thought Shirley, for from the way in which Mr. Graham handled the old cracked dishes and set them up so nicely you never would have known but that they were Haviland china. He never seemed to see them at all when they were cracked. One might have thought that he had been a member of the family for years. He made things seem so nice and comfortable and sociable. Merrily they worked and accomplished wonders that night, for Shirley let them stay until nearly 11 o'clock, just for once, and then they all piled into the car, Shirley and Carol and Elizabeth in the back seat, George and the happy Harley with Graham in the front. If there had been 7 more of them they would have all happily squeezed in. The young Hollisters were having the time of their lives, and as for the Grahams, it wasn't quite certain but that they were also. Certainly society had never seen on Sidney Graham's face that happy, enthusiastic look of intense satisfaction that the moon looked down upon that night. And after all they got home almost as soon as if they had gone on the 10 o'clock trolley. After that, on one pretext or another, Those Grahams were always dropping in on the Hollisters at their work and managing to help, and presently even Shirley ceased to be annoyed or to apologize. The east end of the barn had been selected for bedrooms. A pair of cretonne curtains was stretched across the long, narrow room from wall to partition, leaving the front room for their mother's bed and Doris's crib, and the back room for Shirley and Carol. The boys had taken possession of the loft with many shouts and elaborate preparations, and had spread out their treasures with deep delight, knowing that at least there was room enough for their proper display, and they need feel no fear that they would be thrown out because their place was wanted for something more necessary. Little by little the Hollisters were getting settled. It was not so hard, after all, because there was that glorious big attic in which to put away things that were not needed below, and there was the whole basement for tubs and things, and a lovely faucet down there too, so that a lot of work could be done below the living floor. It seemed just ideal to the girls, who had been for several years accustomed to the cramped quarters of a tiny city house. At last even the beds were made up, and everything had been moved but the bed and a few necessities in their mother's room, which were to come the next day while they were moving their mother. That moving of mother had been a great problem to Shirley until Graham anticipated her necessity and said in a matter-of-fact way that he hoped Mrs. Hollister would let him take her to her new home in his car. Then Shirley's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. She knew her mother was not yet able to travel comfortably in a trolley car, and the price of a taxicab was more than she felt they ought to afford. Yet in her secret heart she had been intending to get one, but now there would be no necessity. Shirley's words of gratitude were few and simple, but there was something in her eyes as she lifted them to Graham's face that made a glow in his heart and fully repaid him for his trouble. The last thing they did when they left the barn that night, before they were coming to stay, was to set the table, and it really looked very cozy and inviting with white cloth on it, and the dishes set out to look their best. Shirley looked back at it with a sweeping glance that took in the great, comfortable living room, the open door into the dining room on one hand, and the vista of a white bed on the other side through the bedroom door. She smiled happily, and then switched off the electric light and stepped out into the sweet spring night. Graham, who had stood watching her as one might watch the opening of some strange, unknown flower, closed and locked the door behind them and followed her down the grassy slope to the car. " Do you know," he said earnestly, " it's been a great thing to me to watch you make a real home out of this bare barn. It's wonderful. It's like a miracle. I wouldn't have believed it could be done. And you have done it so wonderfully. I can just see what kind of a delightful home it is going to be." There was something in his tone that made Shirley forget he was rich and a stranger and her landlord. She lifted her face to the stars and spoke her thoughts. " You can't possibly know how much like heaven it is going to be to us after coming from that other awful little house," she said, " and you are the one who has made it possible. If it hadn't been for you I know I never could have done it." " Oh, nonsense, Miss Hollister. You mustn't think of it. I haven't done anything at all. Just the simplest things that were absolutely necessary." " Oh, I understand," said Shirley, " and I can't ever repay you, but I think God will. That is the kind of thing the kingdom of heaven is made of." " Oh, really now," said Graham, deeply embarrassed. He was not much accustomed to being connected with the kingdom of heaven in any way. " Oh, really, you overestimate it. And as for pay, I don't ask any better than the fun my sister and I have had helping you get settled. It has been a great play for us. We never really moved, you see. We've always gone off and had someone do it for us. I've learned a lot since I've known you." That night, as she prepared to lie down on the mattress and blanket that had been left behind for herself and Carol to camp out on, Shirley remembered her first worries about Mr. Graham, and wondered whether it could be possible that he thought she had been forward in any way, and what her mother would think when she heard the whole story of the new landlord. For up to this time the secret had been beautifully kept from her mother, all the children joining to clap their hands over wayward mouths that started to utter telltale sentences, and the mystery grew, and became almost like Christmas time for little Doris and her mother. It must, however, be stated that Mrs. Hollister that last night, as she lay wakeful on her bed in the little bare room in the tiny house, had many misgivings, and wondered whether perchance she would not be sighing to be back even here 24 hours later. She was holding her peace wonderfully because there really was nothing she could do about it even if she were going out of the frying pan into the fire, but the tumult and worry in her heart had been by no means bliss. So the midnight drew on, and the weary family slept for the last night in the cramped old house where they had lived since trouble and poverty had come